Hey guys, it's Just Crust. I'm back with another YouTube video, and it's been a while. It's been like a month, I think, and today I'm on Minecraft. I was on Minecraft the last time. I did an update video when I was talking about making maybe more total drama content. Yeah, well, you see, I haven't had time, and as I mentioned in that video, um, I don't have time because I'm in school. I'm in college, and um, unlike high school or any other version of school for me, these exams or this exam cycle has been really out of sync to where it's not like consistent. Like one week I'm getting absolutely fucked, and then every other week is like okay. Like for example, 2 weeks ago or like last week I had one exam. This week I have one exam. Next week I have a paper due. Like the fucking is a lot more spread out, and it's a lot more spread out than I anticipated in general. And I think like last year doing it all online, I didn't realize like the full scope of anything that was happening in school. Um, so this is a little bit more of a lot to handle, even if it's not like too much work, specifically, which it still is a little bit of work. But I thought because I'm not going to be making like hour-long video essays like the Total Drama season review, I kind of wanted to start a little series. Because the reason I'm not up, well, first off, I haven't been playing like any games at all. Like I don't think turned on my Xbox, which is like what I stream with, in probably a month, unless it was an accident, because it's right by my feet and I can turn it on with my toes. Um, but I haven't played games in a while, and I feel like like my course of life has been pretty unhealthy. Um, like not having like having a ton of not even just like leisure time, because I do have a lot of leisure time, but like misallocating leisure time. I kind of wanted to change that to where like I can have fun and kind of talk through what I learned. So I hereby am at least going to try to start a series here for as long as I'm in school, called Today or This Week I Learned. Um, and the premise will be hypothetically not this late at night. This late at night, again, it's the first episode, so I kind of, could record it anytime I wanted. Um, but I kind of wanted to have a series where I just kind of talked about my classes and like talk about what I learned that day, or if I get lazy and or swamped this week, like talk about what I learned in a week. I'm currently taking 4 classes. I had to withdraw from one because I'm absolutely brain dead and wasn't going to pass it, as I'm looking at the textbook on my floor right now. Um, and I thought what better way to kind of like, I don't know, it at worst, um, this is just a like a video diary for me, kind of seeing like how I'm processing how I learned, or what I learned and how I learned it, and like how I'm processing my classes. So like, and I thought, instead of just like what I did with like the total drama thing, where it's like you had a tier list, like the tier list screen, and it was basically like podcast form. Like you could watch me play some Minecraft, and like maybe we can get along with it. So I'm gonna do some more world options, and I'm just gonna type in the seed of. Well, here I'll type in a long sentence. Here's to here's to knowledge and consistency. Oh, here's to knowledge. Here's to consistency and school. Um, and I think with that, we'll create a new world. And as it's creating, I could start a little, or I could like talk about my classes. I'm taking 4 classes. I'm taking a math class. I'm taking 2 history classes, and I'm taking a religion class. Um, and I'll be talking about what I learned this week. The first history class I'm taking is about like the Civil War and all of its causes. And so we started late 1700s. We started basically from Revolutionary War era, and we kind of started building week by week, going like very small intricacies of our political system. We spent a lot of time. Um, we really took like a deep dive starting around, I would say Thomas Jefferson, 1800 or so. Also, forgive me, I don't remember a lot of the controls because I have not played Minecraft in a really long time in general, let alone on mouse and keyboard. Um, but so we started like paying attention around the time of Thomas Jefferson around 1800 or that election. We discussed that election. We discussed John Adams, and we talked about federalism versus anti-federalism going into Democratic Republican, the Jeffersonian Republican. And then we spent a lot of we didn't spend a ton of time, but we talked about War of 1812, that kind of stuff. And we went from Age of Jackson. Age of Jackson was a big thing, talking about the tax abominations, nullification crisis, all of those things. And again, because I'm kind of making this like as well as I'm making this for context, I think it's really interesting. I would like to share what I learned. I will be like in specifically in the Civil War class because I know I like the Civil War class a lot more than I thought I would, and I'm just really excited to be able to like share that learning. I'll be name dropping stuff and I'll be using like a lot of the vocab just because like it's history. It's nice to know. So like nullification crisis was South Carolina specifically reacting poorly to the tariff of abomination, which was basically like a really, really heavy tariff. I think like 70% taxing on imports or export, one of the two ports. That made it really hard for South Carolina because South Carolina was the most dominant on exportation and slave. It was exports, I assume, then because South Carolina was very export focused due to them being the only state in the colonial America, or not colonial America, in early antebellum America, to have a dominant slave population over a dominant freed population. However, that's not what I learned this week. But yeah, so we talked a lot about that, and then we moved onwards towards after Age of Jackson, Van Buren to the Log Cabin Campaign of Harrison, and then now we have kind of gone through it. We talked about his accidency, John Tyler, and then shoot, James Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and now we're on James Buchanan. Those were presidents. I don't know. I started with Adams, or I started with Jackson, so 7 to 15. Then we focused on all of their elections, and this week specifically, we took a lot of focus, sort of on the general scale. We talked about the concrete emergence of the Republican Party and how a lot of it could have, or first, actually, hold on, let's like last week into this week, we've spent a lot of time talking about like the parties in general, because from about 1820 to 1850, it was consistent. There was two political parties. It was Whig and it was Whig and it was Democrat. Whig were formed after the Democrats. Obviously, Whigs were formed basically in response to the Democratic Party forming. Um, and we kind of viewed every political action, like if we're talking about elections and other policies, in the scope of Whig versus Democrat. And now, because of the collapse of the Whigs and like the death of, say, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, um, we were zooming out a lot, or we're zooming into a different political age. We've left the second American political party system, or whatever it's called. It's something very similar to that. Um, and we've started discussing the political ramifications of James Buchanan. James Buchanan was a pretty bad president, and I think like no matter what side of the aisle you stand on now, you could probably agree with that. He was very bad at easing slavery tensions. He was a dough face, which basically means I think it was called Northern Man with Southern principles, and they call him a dough face because he was viewed as easily moldable. Holy shit, that did 3 hearts. Um, Easily moldable by the I might just die here like right now. That's really cool. I like this game. Um, he's viewed as very easily moldable by the Democratic Party, because by the time of Franklin Pierce, who was also a Northern Democrat, and James Buchanan, there was it had stopped being political parties and it started being a lot more sectional, which I was gonna say for better or worse, but it was just genuinely for worse. Um, had an effect on everybody's policymaking, and then obviously the collapse of the Whig Party really led to a lot of interesting intricacies. And also, if you'll notice, this class will probably be the most that I have, or will be the class I have the most to talk about. Just because I find it interesting, which again is not something I really was expecting to, but that's just kind of how it went. So this week, and sometimes if like I'm smelting a lot, I can pull up like notes just so like, or like my notes just so I don't like forget anything, or I don't like say completely inaccurate stuff when it comes to my next class. Um, but this week we spent a lot of time talking about the growth of the Republican Party, and such. And specifically on Wednesday, we took a decent dive into the Lincoln Douglas debates, which was Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican in Illinois, versus the incumbent senator Stephen Douglas, who was a very prominent Democrat at the time. And they had a wide series of politicized debates, which really kind of was a national. That election was kind of a general feeling out of what was happening, because those debates came after Bleeding Kansas, which was a big entire thing, which we talked a lot about last week, where basically Kansas was a territory, and Kansas and Nebraska were both territories, and they were going to be admitted to the Union one way or the other. After some debate, I think, shoot, it was they were admitted. The territories were admitted both as not free and not slave. They were both admitted under something called popular sovereignty, which basically means the people get to decide. People get to decide. Nebraska was generally considered north enough to not be like worried as a slave state or as a slave territory. Kansas, however, was surrounded by other slave states and other slave territories, and the biggest example was Missouri. And in Missouri, pro-slavery farmers and pro-slavery settlers, and why the hell do they still hate me? Jesus. Um, Pro-slavery settlers and other people rushed into Kansas trying to claim it and try to like skew the popular sovereignty towards slaveholding. And anti-slavery people did the same thing basically, and that was a whole big debacle, like 5 years long, or like a good couple years long of pro and anti-slavery forces fighting for it, and it culminated in lots of violence, including John Brown, who is a name we heard again this week, as we talked about at the end of this week, because Monday was focused a lot on Lincoln Douglas debates, which was basically a referendum. That was the word I was looking for earlier. It's a referendum on how we're feeling about all of this as a whole, because Stephen Douglas was the champion of popular sovereignty. He was the one who was pitching it to everybody. Well, Abraham Lincoln was the leader of, at the time, the only like true modern party that was like openly or modern at the time party that was anti-slavery. Um, and by okay, I'll rephrase again, because there was like it was the new wave of whatever the hell. It was the new wave of abolitionism, where they believed it should like at least Abraham Lincoln, a pretty central Republican, because there's obviously fuck, what's the word? there's obviously extremists on both sides, radicals who thought both immediatism, like they should be freed immediately, and that the trade of slaves should end, like the expansion of slavery should end. However, it's okay to like, or like the trade would be okay, or like keeping it in the slaves that already, or the states that already were, was fine. But the debates were a referendum on slavery, and while Stephen Douglas ended up winning the senatorial seat in Illinois, the newspaper coverage, they were highly publicized debates. Um, the newspaper coverage itself really grew Lincoln into almost a celebrity status, um, which started to help boost the Republicans, because the Republicans ran a campaign in '56, which was, I think, only a year or two before the Douglas debates, um, which was pretty successful for new party terms, but they still lost to Millard Fillmore, or not Millard Fillmore, James Buchanan. Um, and at the same time, while these debates aimed and actually helped um, Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, they also harmed the Democrats as a whole. Because while Stephen Douglas won the seat, it showed the increasing divide between him as a moderate Democrat and the Democrats of the South, known as, well, a lot of them would be considered today as fire eaters, who were basically vehemently pro-slavery Democrats. And Stephen Douglas's victory alienated that kind of group, where the fire eaters basically were very demanding of James Buchanan policy-wise, and that whole general thing where it's like there's moderate Democrats and then there's like the fire eaters who are warmongering. They threaten disunion a lot. That's a key like concept in this class, like in our class, is the concept of disunion. I'm just making sure I'm still recording. Um, the concept of disunion is that basically different parties at different times were threatening the sanctity of the union itself, which in the early period, the first 100 years or so, give or take, that this country was founded, excuse me, preserving the union above all else was considered the main goal. And that was actually almost a direct quote from Andrew Jackson during the nullification crisis, because the nullification crisis, South Carolina nullified the Tariff of Abominations and said, if you do anything to stop us, we will secede. And at a party, basically, I think it was a party in Thomas Jefferson's name, um, like, remembering the Jacksonians, or just at this point, the Democrats, um, remembering their Jeffersonian Republican roots. And at that very rally, Jackson commented on this issue by saying, preserve the Union at all costs, which was really, in all people's opinions, a pretty interesting thing to say at that very point in time. But anyway, so we discussed that. And then on Wednesday, we discussed a lot about John Brown's raid, which was basically John Brown was a radical abolitionist who, first off, fought in Bleeding, Kansas against the pro-slavery people, which was a really interesting thing, was that the pro-slavery forces, or the pro-slavery people in Kansas, were like actively looting and attacking the anti-slavery free soilers of Kansas. And it was really interesting. They had two entire governments set up, and there was an active attempt to try to pass a constitution within Kansas during this time called the Lecompton Constitution, which was very pro-slavery focused. Or basically, it was held, a referendum on the Lecompton Constitution was held without any of the pro-slave, or of the anti-slavery people in attendance. I believe they all boycotted the vote, which led to the Continental Compromise passing in general. And while basically the pro-slavery forces didn't allow the anti-slavery forces to pass it, or to vote to see if it should be passed or not, which was the really problematic thing of it all. Ow. It was all very problematic. And then more and more pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces started clashing, which basically eventually led... God, motherfucking skeletons, dude! Alright, there we go. You guys have to, I guess, time your hits better. By that point, the violence has escalated, and then there was John Brown's raid. John Brown, again, was a fighter during all of Bleeding Kansas. He fought for the anti-slavery Free Soilers, obviously. But after all of that, he went back home for a while. But then after that little while of him being at home, he started gathering soldiers. And the soldiers eventually, they got together and they're like, we need to free slavery. We need to free some slaves, basically. And they kind of, they agreed on where they were going to go and where they were going to do it. They were going to do it at Harper's Ferry, which is now part of West Virginia. Basically, they were going to raid the Harper's Ferry Armory, get guns, go into the forest, and then do planned hits on plantations to free slaves. Admirable goal. It failed. He died. Or no, he did not die in the fighting. I think they had a band of 22 fighters, maybe, and they took Harper's Ferry real quick. And then instead of retreating into the woods like he said he would, he stood and fought. And he eventually, I think like 9 died and a lot got captured, including him, and he was hanged. And excuse me, we kind of, near the end of Wednesday's class, we talked a lot about the repercussions of that, such as the parties and how they reacted, because obviously his views more so aligned with the Republican view of anti-slavery. But this was a really radical thing to do, even for an anti-slavery section. So the Republicans had to toe a fine line of saying that his motives were good, his actions were not, while the Democrats could just openly condemn him. And also, we looked a lot at newspaper articles from a... Hold on. Give me 1 second. I need to check something. Sorry about that. My roommate was texting me about something. So basically, we talked a lot about the Republicans and how they had to toe a fine line between condemning the actions he did, which was raiding an armory. I believe he killed a decent amount, like a couple people, and while also saying like motive good, action bad. To an extent, some Republicans just denied it wholeheartedly. And then Democrats could just paint this as the most radical thing ever and show that all Republicans were extremists and this, that, and the other. And it was really an interesting debate. And then there was a third section of that, which was, Jesus, the opinions of the opposition party, which was a party located in the South, which were Southern Democrats that didn't completely agree with what they were doing. Dude, how accurate are they? Jesus. And those were really interesting to read because they were also towing a fine line where it's like they believed in slavery. They wanted the proliferation of slavery, but they didn't want to go so wholeheartedly to say that it was disunion, and they didn't also want to pretend to not understand John Brown's motives. But it's like, for example, it'll definitely not be as long as that was because I also just gave like a class recap as well, like a whole class recap as well as what happened this week. So and then for dude, what the hell? Die already, please. Oh wow. So the other classes I have right now, I'm in linear algebra, which that's cool. This week, Tuesday was a review class. Thursday was an exam. Real rough scene. The exam was really rough. Our exam was on basically linear transformations, span, um, stuff like that, like span, and then vector spaces and subspaces, which are still unbeknownst to me, really, like truly and honestly. I particularly did not know what they were in general, or like I'm not very good at that. I missed the class where we learned it. It's not recorded, so I missed it in general. Um, all I really knew, I knew how to do some of it. I'm just gonna hope for a lot of partial credit. We also learned about like column space, row space, and vector or a null space of a matrix, how to relate those to the kernel and the range of the transformation, which are all words that you might think that I'm just name dropping because I don't particularly know what they mean either. Honestly, like I'm just as much in the dark here as you guys are, because I really don't know what the fuck like most of those mean. I just kind of know what they equal to like a rough extent, and like saying I know what they equal is like barely because I messed up a lot on that exam. Um, and then I also have a Christianity class, which is a lot about the New Testament. So this week, my professor was sick on Monday, so we didn't. This was kind of a weird week to start it on, but I also got the idea like last night, and I really liked it. I felt, if nothing more, oh god, I just did not switch to my axe. Like if nothing more than like this could be at best a consistent series for me to do and like kind of keep myself focused. Why are there so many creepers in this hole? At best, it's something that I can do to keep myself focused on classes and stuff throughout the year, while also giving myself a little bit of leisure time as well as a little consistency for the channel. Hopefully, if I keep remembering to do them. But this week we again, my professor was sick on Monday, but Wednesday we discussed acts. What the fuck, dude? Oh my god. Like this is genuinely like kind of getting annoying at this point. We talk about acts, and we particularly were kind of noting because we just got finished reading all of Paul's letters, like Philippians, Galatians, Corinthians, and stuff. And like that last week, that was pretty interesting. We read them, or we were supposed to read them. Um, and then we talked about pseudepigraphical writing, which is basically writing in somebody else's name. And we kind of discussed that a lot of Paul's letters could be pseudepigraphical, or like just not written by Paul, which in general I felt was a pretty interesting concept, considering how it's taught. Um, and this week we kind of continued on to Acts because Paul is one of the main characters, I use in quotes, of Acts. Um, and like we just discussed generally Acts, and we discussed some of the interesting like narrative explanations or narrative choices with what the fuck, dude? Get out of here! Get out of here, dude! All right, dude, come on now. We're gonna need to do something here. Um, but anyway, we talked about just kind of the narrative choices that were made um within motherfucking. I lost my train of thought because the near death experience really got to me. Um, we talked a lot about the narrative choices within Paul, such as I have to like talk like word by word at this point. Um, such as the differences in characterization and like differences in just how him and the apostles as a whole are viewed during Acts, and how they somewhat contradict what he personally said in his letters, like in Galatians. And we use specifically Galatians a lot, um, as a good representation of his beliefs, because in Galatians he's talking specifically about Christianity with the Gentiles, and talking about Christianity with the Gentiles and circumcision, um, and how basically if you're circumcised and you like if you actively circumcise, or like you circumcise yourself to follow Christ, Christ will do nothing with you in your body, um, and such like that. And there is specifically in Galatians, he mentions a circumcision faction that may or may not be led by James, brother of God, or brother of Jesus, brother of whomever. Um, and that was interesting. And then in Acts, it's kind of spun on itself, where it's not a circumcision faction within Christianity. They're just circumcised followers of Jesus, and instead of Paul doing a lot of the preaching towards him or preaching towards them, it's actually Peter, which was an interesting change, obviously, because in Galatians we note that it's Paul doing the preaching. Um, and in general, throughout Paul's letters, it's kind of narratively seen. Um, it's kind of narratively seen that Paul is um, at odds with some of the apostles about their viewpoints and such as him being at odds with James and him having debates with Peter. But the Acts, we discussed that basically the core of the Acts is to show a unity among the apostles, which was kind of unseen at the time, or like was that like to misrepresent um, the apostles as ones of unity instead of as a kind of divided section of Christianity, which was acknowledged basically. So that was interesting. And then my last class is economic history. So basically, we talk about America from colonial times to present. And right now, we're talking about the economics of slavery. And we've talked basically the whole week about, was slavery profitable? How profitable? And then eventually, did slavery hold back the South as a whole? And these answers are deep, steeped in numbers and like specifics that I don't particularly know, or I don't particularly remember completely off the top of my head. Um, and like basically, we also discussed, did slavery like stunt the South's industrialization, for example, and stuff like that. And this class was really interesting. Or these classes were really interesting because like, it's neat to see first off the approach at how economists take to looking at the data, and then in most cases, honestly, because we talk about all cases in the historiographical debate. In a lot of cases, it's interesting to see how they're wrong, um, which we also took a little bit of a look at. And with the profitability of slavery, it really depended. We came to the conclusion through use of a ton of numbers that slavery was not going away anytime soon. That was the main takeaway, was that slavery was there to stay, and that a civil war was genuinely necessary to make it go away. And that's how that went. And then did slavery stunt the growth? Signs point towards yes. And we looked at like per capita income, and we looked a lot at we looked at money or labor capital, land, enterprise, market, industry, and like one other. We looked at 7 different things, and the conclusion that we could come to, the conclusion that we could come to was basically maybe like because we kind of settled on, to know for sure, we need to be able to somehow isolate the South without slavery. And while that is impossible, we'll never particularly know if it was profitable, or like if their growth would be different with or without it. Because most of the other debates, like when we looked at like debates for land, and if that made a difference, um, and like looking at like the market itself and like industrialization, all of those things were happening at different rates, and the reason in general could simply be because of slavery, and because there's like an absorption hypothesis that talked about the money in slavery wasn't redispersed, but it was simply absorbed, and like they couldn't invest as much, which was considered complete, or was found wrong. Like it was just wrong, because when purchasing slaves, it was reallocating funds. It was not absorbing funds. But that was an interesting little thing to talk about, like the absorption theory or whatever. Um, and then like that was the kind of debate, which, or not debate because we were not contributing as a class. It was just more talking about like we came to the conclusion in general that we can't know for sure, obviously, but if there were to be irreparable differences within the North and South, it would be in the mismanagement and lack of. I don't know if you can hear people outside. That's not in my building. That is literally like, that's like outside. I'm not on the first floor. So that's neat. Anyway, didn't ask, don't matter. Um so we just talked about like basic, like if there was a notable change, it would be within, or it would be mostly due to the land, or due to the labor, and how slavery affected the labor market, and how the use of owned labor really messed up the specialization and the skills obtained by workers, and that kind of stuff. And so, and we talked about, obviously earlier in the semester, about Adam Smith, and basically the main thing to note is that specialization is efficient, and the labor structure within the South, we have determined over like fucking 6 classes by this point, has been that slavery is inefficient at its core. Um, all right, I think that's basically my that's basically all I've got for my soapbox today. That's what I've learned this week, and I hope to continue this in the future. So if you enjoyed, please like, comment, tell me that you liked it, and hopefully they will never be as long as this one. Thanks so much for watching. See ya.